And I love how sound has like kind of untapped potential for helping us understand our bodies. You know, medical profession is all about language and text and image. They never use sound to help people understand how a drug works or how an illness or a physical condition behaves. But it makes total sense to me because the body is, well, it's like an incredible orchestra. It makes all of these sounds.
Hello everyone, my name is Nojus and you're listening to Nara Podcast. Today I want to share a conversation with Helen Anahita Wilson. She's an award-winning composer and experimental music artist and a researcher at SOAS University of London. This November she performed at the Mental Health Arts Festival Ryšiai in Vilnius. Just a few weeks before COVID reached Europe, Helen was diagnosed with an aggressive breast cancer. She then went through an intense 15-month treatment which included chemotherapy and surgery. This experience let her rediscover sound in a new way and inspired to experiment with music that can tell stories about health, illness, and the body without words. Helen and I talked about the sound of cell death, her album created specifically to be listened to during chemotherapy sessions, and how sound might help us understand our bodies more deeply. A reflection on the performance in Vilnius became a starting point for the conversation you're about to hear. If you ever experienced serious illness yourself or had to take care of your relative, I hope you'll find this conversation insightful. Yesterday you performed at the Mental Health Arts Festival Ryšiai, which in English it would be probably Connections, which takes place for the third time only, so it's pretty young festival, but you made a performance titled Jugalbandi.
Yeah, that's right. So I was performing with cellist Anton Lukashevich, and the main portion of the performance was a duo, which in Indian classical music, which we may talk about more later, there's this wonderful word which is jugalbandi, and it means a duo or a bonded pair. So we had a performance with Anton on the cello and me playing percussion. There was also a talk and a solo piano piece to finish the evening. The Jugalbandi was improvised, and the piano piece actually was my own arrangement of a piece by a Japanese composer called Some Sato. The piece is called Incarnation 2, and I felt that it served the occasion well, because we were talking a lot about time and how when you're seriously ill, and also when you're caring for someone who's seriously ill, your experience of time really changes. And in this piece, the sound is so resonant, and it builds for 10 minutes continuously with the pedal of the piano down. It feels as if time is collecting and pooling around you. There's no future linear sense. It's this incredible, resonant, reverberant moment in time, which I thought reflected at least my experience of serious illness.
I think it was a very intimate night because the venue hall was quite small and there was maybe like 30 people in there, and you played acoustic music, so it was very quiet, but it was also very special.
I thought it was a lovely venue, and we were deciding whether or not to use microphones to amplify the performance, and Anton and I both decided that it's nicer to play acoustically and to invite the audience to listen in and to lean in towards us. I feel that quite often music is too loud. It's great if it's a big gig and you've gone to see a band and there's 1,000 people there, and that's joyous when the volume is really high. But for something that is a musical performance that is in its nature very intimate, and a performance that is expressing something very personal and very intimate, it's nice to keep the volume low so that people have to lean towards the sound. And I think that creates a better listening experience for us on stage and also for the audience.
Yes. And you, at the introduction of the piece, you mentioned that you like reading biographies. There's not enough music that would be biographical, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always loved, since I was a child, reading diaries and letters and biographies. I find real life more interesting than fiction. I also love poetry, but there's something about diaries and letters and memoirs that I adore. And I feel that so many other art forms, either in text, so with language like a diary, or in the visual arts that are documenting episodes from people's lives, we are so lucky to have a wealth of these texts or exhibitions. But why is it that composers and sound artists don't do this so much? I guess sometimes with sound art, we have field recordings where people are recording, they're walking through a city or sat in a hospital or what have you, but the real sounds of that time. But that very often doesn't have the same creative aspect to it. And then when it comes to music, there are pieces of music that tell stories, but they often involve the voice and involve singing and language. And why is it that there seem to be so few pieces of music about a composer's personal experience that actually tells a story, and tells a story through rhythm specifically, and tells a story through texture? I cannot understand it. And so much of my recent work has been about trying to develop techniques for storytelling through music, and I call this sonic life writing. So writing about my life or other people's lives, because I've composed works about famous scientists, for instance, like Dorothy Hodgkin, a UK chemist. How do we tell a life story through sound and without language? And one of the reasons that I want to do it is because language can be very misleading, and also image can sometimes be difficult for people to identify with, or it's sort of misrepresentational in some way, whereas sound, we don't have those same associations. Sound feels, now I really don't like this word, but it's popped into my mind, it's slightly purer in a way.
I was gonna ask, how do you find language also restricting, or what are language limits? What are the opportunities of sound as a media to express difficult experiences?
My motivation really for trying to explore these ways of sonic storytelling comes from problems that I've encountered in language. So a few years ago, I had a very difficult experience for a couple of years where I had cancer treatment, going through chemotherapy and radiotherapy, surgery, immunotherapy, various other things, which I'm pleased to say was successful. But I would read diaries and letters written by other people who'd gone through similar experiences. And so often the language I thought was kind of crazy, actually, in some ways. And specifically about cancer, in English, it's very common to use metaphors about war and warfare and battles. And I have a big problem with that. Firstly, because as soon as you think about a battle, there's a winner and a loser. And we could argue that everyone's losers in this, but generally it's about winning and losing. And I think that's deeply unfair on people who undergo treatment, because we're lauding the survivor as if somehow that person who survives is a more brilliant and a more brave person than the person for whom treatment was not successful. And I think that is crazy. It's really all about how early you can detect that cancer and treat it. And there are other factors too, but to pitch survivors against non-survivors in that judgment, I think, is just awful. And secondly, I don't think it is about battling. Yes, the body is harmed through treatment, so you might think of the body as a site of a battle that gets poisoned. You get cut open. All sorts of other things happen to you, which are very difficult experiences. But the psychological, the mental aspect behind it is not a battle at all. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. So it's about yielding and trusting and being quite passive. So you have to trust these teams of people who come into your life, total strangers. These are doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals, pharmacists, and you don't know them, and they do the most awful things to your body that cause you lots of pain and lots of challenge, and you trust them that they are doing these awful things with the best intentions to save your life, but you're actually leaning back and giving your body to these teams of strangers. It's not a battle where you have any real agency in. So those are the kind of issues with language, just a couple of examples, that I think is just really misleading and perpetuates all kinds of false understandings about cancer and contribute to some of the unhelpful ways that many societies in the West and beyond view cancer and judge cancer and contribute to some of the guilt and the shame that can be associated with the disease. Whereas sound is quite different. Sound, we don't have any of these kind of connotations or associations. Perhaps you might be able to use metaphors in sound, but I've found that expressing stories and feelings about my own experience of a cancer through sound allows my audiences to approach the subject with a new kind of curiosity that opens up a conversation, and people ask questions that they would never usually ask if somebody was sharing their diary or if we were at a photographic exhibition.
Can you give some examples of what people have asked?
Some of it is the sheer engagement, because I think people often worry about saying the wrong thing, because of course it is a sensitive topic and nobody wants to upset anybody, but also people feel that they don't have the right language, and that's because the language that we do have is wrong. But the curiosity that people share with me, because they've listened to, say, a piece of music that I've composed where the composition breaks down in exactly the same way that my own cancer cells did. Somebody is able to witness something that I went through, and they're able to witness a biological process that is actually happening inside all of our bodies all the time. I wrote a piece called Krankenhausfunk and the Extrinsic Death Receptor Pathway, which was a reimagining of hospital radio, and the piece of music uses 3 audio files from my treatment, and I disintegrate these and I break them down in exactly the same way as my cancer cells were treated. And what's been quite interesting is sharing this with audiences and sharing with everybody that this type of cell death is happening inside all of our bodies right now. There's 700,000 cell deaths every second in our bodies. And to be able to hear that over the course of a 30-minute piece is quite an interesting experience for me and for the audience. And it feels to me like a kind of testimonial, and that I'm allowing people to witness something that's personal to me, but actually is happening inside all of our bodies all the time. And I love how sound has like kind of untapped potential for helping us understand our bodies. You know, medical profession is all about language and text and image. They never use sound to help people understand how a drug works or how an illness or a physical condition behaves. But it makes total sense to me because the body is, well, it's like an incredible orchestra. It makes all of these sounds. And we're also very rhythmic creatures. You know, our cells die in certain patterns and all of this kind of thing. And all of this can be exactly replicated in sound. And it can be done in a way that can cross cultures and societies because you don't need a language. I know it's a bit of a big cliche when people say that music is the universal language, and I don't think I quite agree with that. But we are able to have collective experiences through sound and music that perhaps we're not quite so able to do with text and language and image.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, sound is more accurate representation of all of these different complex things that are happening in our bodies than words, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I'm about to start a big project funded by the Wellcome Trust in the UK, which is going to explore how we can better understand our bodies through sound and through music. I'll be looking at all sorts of things, hearts and bones and reproductive systems, and how we might learn to also come to terms with our bodies, because I feel like a lot of us don't quite understand our own physiology, or we live in societies where we're encouraged to be embarrassed about how we look or how we sound, or, you know, there's so much pressure from kind of corporate world that we should all be, you know, adhering to certain beauty standards and all the rest of it, rather than actually dealing with the reality of life and our bodies. And so I'm incredibly excited to see how doing a deep dive for the next 4 years on the possibilities of sound and music, describing our bodies, sounding out our bodies, and sharing experiences with other people might hopefully have some kind of useful intervention in at least medicine, if not a kind of a wider societal impact.
I would like to go back a bit to that moment when you were having the cancer treatment in the hospital.
Yeah.
Just to understand what you were going through, maybe physically, maybe you could share a bit of details.
Yeah.
How did chemotherapy affect your body and your well-being?
Yeah. So I received a diagnosis at Christmas 2019, and it was a real shock because I was 37, I think, at the time. And the diagnosis came a day before I was due to fly to India for many months to work out there. And so it was a huge disruption, and it was a very fast-growing cancer, like way past the usual kind of top growth rate. So we had to... I mean sort of me and the doctors, we had to start treatment very quickly. And I think more often than not, people would have surgery to remove the cancer, and then they would have chemotherapy afterwards. What's interesting about that is that the chemotherapy is really of very little use to, I think, more than 90% of people. But in my case, I had to have chemotherapy first to shrink the cancer before it could be removed. So one comfort I do find is that the chemotherapy was necessary, whereas for many people, chemotherapy is totally unnecessary and they suffer with no benefit. But for me, I take some comfort in this. So it was quite an intensive day when you go and receive chemotherapy. I remember turning up to the hospital for the first time and sitting in the waiting room and listening to such inappropriate music. I couldn't believe it. So one of the first things I heard when I sat in the waiting room was the Bee Gees singing Staying Alive, which was just crazy. And then there was quite a long wait to go in. And, the longer you wait, the more nervous and apprehensive you get, of course, because you're sitting with these feelings of anticipation. And just before the nurse came out to call my name, this really dark piece of classical music by Prokofiev started playing. And it was so ominous and incredibly inappropriate for that kind of environment. It's really dramatic. It's actually the theme tune for a really silly reality TV show in the UK. And the nurse came out whilst this big orchestral piece was playing. I thought, this is just crazy. So I go into the main room and there's like 25 people in there on machines. And after a long time of trying to get the needle into my hand, eventually we get there and I'm attached to the chemotherapy machine and I'm there for 9 hours. So I have 2 chemotherapy drugs and 2 immunotherapy drugs. And it was tremendously daunting and frightening. Because you have to sign things and you have to give your permission to be poisoned. And I'm basically being given lethal doses of poison that I have to agree to. And then I'm kind of artificially kept alive. So I'm being poisoned to death and then artificially kept alive with injections and other things to try and keep my immune system going. So it's a crazy thing to hold in your mind, and I felt like I was slipping in between worlds, dead or alive or somewhere in the middle. And for many people, chemotherapy is not too much of an issue. There are so many different types of drugs. I think, foolishly, I might have been under the impression that chemotherapy was just kind of 1 or 2 different drugs. There's loads of different ones, and some are much more gentle on the body. But because my cancer was quite extreme, I had a very high dose of a very toxic, very serious drug. One of the many consequences of it was that I had a type of ear poisoning. So one of the drugs was made from platinum. So it was a heavy metal poisoning that totally changed my experience of sound. And I heard all sorts of kind of like underwater whale sounds a lot of the time. And then sometimes people's voices sounded like very high-pitched robots. And it was like sort of, it was just weird. It's like these aural hallucinations. That was one of the kind of artistically interesting side effects from all this. But I mean, I had this regime every 3 weeks, and every few days you'd get a different set of symptoms. For me, it was really challenging, and I ended up in hospital a lot of times, being very unwell. And one of the good things about cancer treatment in 2020 during the pandemic was that I didn't have to go through the full regime, because my immune system was so low. They said that if I caught COVID, I'd die. So I could come off the chemotherapy early, which was brilliant news. Mm-hmm. Such good news, because for me, it was a very challenging experience. But I'm always very conscious when I talk about it that many people do not have a really difficult experience on chemotherapy. And it was only because my particular combination of drugs at a high dose for a very aggressive cancer meant that I had a very difficult time. But for a lot of people, it's much, much easier. So I'm conscious not to frighten anybody, but in telling my own real story.
That was just your personal experience.
Yeah.
For 18 months?
So fortunately, I was only on chemotherapy for about 3 months. Which is so good and such a relief. And then I managed to get surgery early. What was also fantastic and explains why my side effects were so bad is the chemotherapy was so effective that when they came to scan me halfway through, the cancer had completely vanished and completely gone. So actually I didn't need double that amount. It was, it really worked, which makes sense, if losing all your hair, well, I lost half of my hair, but, your hair falling out and going through all sorts of strange physical symptoms with your eyes and your mouth and your fingernails and all sorts of things, just shows you that it's working. So I think that's also sometimes a helpful thing for people to remember, that if they are suffering during treatment, generally means that treatment is successful and is doing something. And sometimes that can be a little piece of information to hang on to when it gets really tough and you feel like you can't carry on with it.
And I wanted to ask about the role of music during that time. And how did you think about music in a different way, or how did it shape your understanding of sounds? I think it's almost literally you had a different understanding of sound. Yeah. So with the ear poisoning, my perception of sound totally changed, and I found quite a lot of music kind of overwhelming in some way. I've always been very sensitive to all kinds of sensory stimuli, but I became extra sensitive. There were all sorts of pieces of music that usually I would love that I just couldn't listen to at all, because something about the frequencies being perceived through my poisoned ear made them incredibly uncomfortable. And I became really keen on much slower, more textural, ambient kind of music, and also thinking of music as, I think actually for the first time thinking of music as an escape. So usually I think of music as something that needs to be very actively engaged with, active listening. And this, for the first time in my life, was a situation where I would escape into music in order to, say, be distracted from the hospital room with all of these other people on the machines. So it was kind of using music functionally, like trying to use music with a purpose in order to make my life easier, which is the first time that really I'd done that. I've always been interested in the music itself for the sake of music. And now it was like music with a purpose. So in a way, music became your defense mechanism to deal with the treatment side effects.
Yeah.
Right? Can you elaborate more? How did it look like, or how did you engage in music in that environment?
Yeah, so there were two changes, I suppose. One was changing the style of music that I was listening to, and also the style of music that I was playing myself at home. So I'm a pianist by trade, and the kind of music that I would practice at home was totally different to the kind of music that I would play normally. But what I found was that thinking musically allowed me to have some kind of agency through my treatment. So I trained as a Western classical pianist, but in my sort of early to mid-30s, I went to retrain in South Asian classical music, Indian classical music, and much of my study was related to rhythm, and I love how rhythm operates in Indian classical music. It's so thrilling and so just kind of joyous and virtuosic and game-like, actually, like really playful. And it operates in a variety of numerical systems and also operates through shapes and geometry, which if you've been raised in the West, we don't really think of music in a two-dimensional, three-dimensional kind of way. But to think of rhythms through shapes, I found really interesting. But when I would sit in the hospital for 9 hours, I looked around at the medication bag, chemotherapy bags, the forms that I would have to sign and that kind of thing. And they were covered in numbers. So my own medical data. And I started to read these as rhythms and interpret them through Indian classical techniques. So a lot of the time when I was sat there, I was composing the whole time, and I was using all of these bits of information about my treatment and about my health and turning them, converting them into music, and either writing them down or vocalizing them.
Tak, meet, June, tak, meet, June, tak, meet, tom ta, di, ki, na, tom ta, di, ki, na, tom ta.
To help pass the time and keep her brain active during chemotherapy sessions, Helen would practice kanakol, a vocal exercise originated in South India. The recording you hear right now was made in February 2020 in a hospital in Brighton. You can hear two types of short repetitive phrases. They change according to the mathematical structure of time cycles called tala.
So I started in real time telling my own story through sound. And I suppose that's the first time ever that it had occurred to me that I could sound out my own experience in that kind of way.
Helen also responded to the metronomic sounds of hospital equipment through hand gestures, known as kriya in South India. These gestures indicate the speed and subdivision of tala. At Nara website, you can watch a video of Helen making these gestures. This engagement in music must have helped you, I'm assuming must have helped you throughout the treatment, right? You found a purpose in it.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely. I felt like I had some kind of agency in the process. And I think also because it was COVID times, I wasn't allowed to see anybody. So I couldn't see any friends. I couldn't really talk to anybody about my experience on a day-to-day level. I mean, I was sort of very open about it generally and, made it publicly known what I was going through. I wasn't hiding it. But I felt as if I was being censored or I was being silenced in some way because I wasn't allowed to spend time with anybody. And so this became a way of sharing my experience and sharing my testimony in that way by turning it into music, and music that can then be repeated and played and performed and recorded and broadcast. So my story kind of has this onward life.
And was PhD part of this onward life? How, when you discovered the power of sound to tell your autobiographical story?
Yeah, definitely. So my original PhD research was all about Indian classical music in Kerala, which is down in the very south of India. And I had to cancel all of my research and all of my travel. Firstly, because of the cancer diagnosis, and then secondly, because of COVID, because no one was going anywhere, And I told my PhD supervisor, Dr. Richard Williams at SOAS in London, what I was doing with these numbers and turning them into compositions and practicing rhythm in the hospital. And he suggested that there might be a PhD somewhere in there. Maybe I could pivot my research, use all of the work that I'd already done on Indian rhythm and performance, but just find a new direction for it. And that was so helpful, because then I had about 2.5 years to write more compositions and to really come to terms with what had happened to me and to create opportunities for people to hear this music and to approach the topic of cancer from a completely new direction and a new perspective. Going back to what we said earlier about inviting curiosity. And when you listen to a piece of music about someone's body, or about everybody's body, it creates this really interesting opportunity for people to witness and to form a different kind of understanding. So the PhD was really valuable, and I called it an autobiography, not an auto. It's an otto or auto. It's OTO, biography. So that prefix of otto relates to the ear, and it relates to listening. Jacques Derrida wrote a little bit about autobiography, and talking about how the potential in that word takes it from the solo person of auto, A-U-T-O, about it being about the self, to making it potentially plural, because O-T-O is kind of anonymous, right? So I love the idea of this biography that can be listened to. And yes, it comes from my personal experience, but it also speaks to everybody's bodies. And I kind of like that in my work, is being able to get to a point where I remove myself from it. And it may be motivated and inspired by something that I've experienced, but I try to leave that at a certain stage in the creative process and make it anonymous and plural in some way.
Mm-hmm. When I was listening to Jugalbandi yesterday, I did think a lot about those roles that you as musicians you took. The way cello was playing was so unpredictable, and it was I was thinking how else you can make sound with a single instrument still in a very novel way. And the drum was playing very repetitively and predictably. Is Jugalbandi a result of your, the performance part is a result of your PhD work?
Yes, yeah. So it's the final part of the autobiography. I wanted to create a chapter that was about relationships during those kind of challenging times. So actually writing something that wasn't about my body and what was going on with it and inside it, but thinking about the bond between people, the person who's incredibly sick, going through, a life-threatening experience, and the person who cares for them. And because it was COVID time, I spent a lot of that time just completely on my own. I lived alone at that time. And sometimes my mother would come and stay when I was receiving chemotherapy, and she stayed when I had the surgery. It's kind of an interesting, fluctuating relationship, and it's really challenging for both of you in completely different ways, and actually in some ways, not for a moment to seem ungrateful for my mother's care, but sometimes it's just easier to be on your own, and there are parts of that cancer treatment where it's just easier, because it can be so hard for somebody to watch somebody they love going through something that is so difficult and painful. It's so hard. And so to do it solo is sometimes the best way of doing it. But what I was kind of interested in is this fluctuation between need for attachment and need of help, and then at other times, need for absolute independence and not wanting any help from anybody. And sometimes you can kind of feel that at exactly the same time, which is strange, but true. I read a wonderful work by Lisa Baretza, who's a sociologist or a psychosociologist at Birkbeck University in London. The book is called Enduring Time, and it describes so wonderfully how during these challenging times, our experience of time is totally disrupted. So when you're going through something like cancer treatment, or, a cancer treatment that is quite intensive and extensive, that goes on for a long time and involves a lot of different treatments, your sense of time is totally disrupted. You're kind of suspended. You don't know if it's going to be successful. You don't know how long you're going to live. You don't know from 1 hour to the next how your body is going to feel, so you can't plan anything. And then from a caregiving perspective, it's like you have this kind of duty to be dependable and to repeat and maintain and persevere and return. So with the drum parts in the performance, I was trying to play out all of these rhythms of caregiving, which are predictable and dependable. Whereas Anton, playing on the cello, was able to improvise, which is what illness is. A lot of the time, you're just improvising and trying to get through that day or that hour or that treatment cycle. For his part, he was trying to explore these fluctuations in the bond. So sometimes locking in with the rhythm that I was playing to express that need for help and that need for attachment. And then at other times, musically trying to move as far away as possible from what I was playing. So trying to kind of run in the opposite direction.
And I would want to come back a bit to the chemotherapy topic. You released an album, right? It originates from the plants who are used in the chemotherapy medicine, right?
Yeah. So I think it's really remarkable and really strange that we don't have better understandings of the medicines that we take. Not just for cancer, but for all kinds of health conditions, even just for a headache or something. Many of us do not understand that so many pharmaceutical drugs are derived from plants and from natural sources. And I think for me, if I had known, if somebody had told me that one of the main chemotherapy drugs that I was receiving actually came from the same tree that I had in my garden when I was a child, I would have found that so reassuring. And yes, I know that that tree, the yew tree, is poisonous. And I remember my mother telling me that I mustn't, eat the berries or touch it and rub my eyes or something like that. I'm aware that it's toxic. But having that piece of information, rather than just thinking of these drugs as incredibly poisonous, horrible chemicals that were created in a laboratory that I'm being poisoned with, I would have found the experience easier. And so I came across an article by a fantastic botanist, Dr. Sandy Knapp, at the Natural History Museum in London. She'd written a beautiful article about the plants involved in her own breast cancer treatment. And I read this and I thought it was so fantastic. I wrote an email to her to thank her. And we ended up having lunch and talking about our treatments and talking about the plants that are used in all kinds of medicines. And I decided to try to create a piece of music that would make the sonic experience of a hospital, at least of a UK hospital, a little bit easier for people, because it's a very extreme, noisy environment. It's not a great place to be at all. The walls, everywhere is very hard, so the sound waves bounce around the space, and you can hear all of these machines going. You can often hear sounds of suffering, and people crying or people in distress. It's difficult. It's really difficult. And then there are the things like the inappropriate music in the waiting room and all of that kind of stuff. I just think our sonic experience needs improving. So I thought, well, maybe I could try and write a piece of music that is made from the same plants that many chemotherapy drugs come from.
Helen's creative goal was successful. The music she mentions became an album titled Linea Naturalis, We're All Bioelectrical Beings. Recorded in 2023, it was dedicated to people undergoing cancer treatment. Many chemotherapy and other anti-cancer treatments are derived from plants, exactly the same ones recorded in the album you are hearing right now.
And what's important to say is that I'm not creating work with sounds that the plants themselves make. That's really important to say. What I do is actually I collect information like natural electricity, bioelectricity readings from plants, and all sorts of other types of genetic data and physiological readings. I can put conductivity monitors on plants, and as there are changes in light levels or changes in hydration, I get a different reading. And a little bit like my medical data, I then get streams of numbers coming back to me. And very often there are some fantastic little patterns in the data, which to me immediately seem musical. So I take out those patterns and I transform that into a little sound pattern or motif, and then I compose with that using techniques from Indian classical music and from Western classical music. So it's kind of a co-creation, co-production. It's very much about trying to connect listeners back to nature whilst being in an unnatural environment by listening to a piece of music that was derived from the same plants that their drugs are derived from. So I try to think of the composition process as being quite similar to medical researchers and pharmaceutical companies in a way, where you take an extract of a plant and then you work with it to create something. So I take an extract from these plants in the form of data, and then I compose with it to build it into something bigger.
So rather than just pure sonification and plants being used as instruments, they're more like collaborators.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Occasionally I do use pure sonification, and you can listen to extraordinary rhythms, say from inside a tree. So you can listen to the movement of moisture, of fluid from within inside, and you get wonderful little popping rhythms. And I do use those sometimes in my work. But generally I'm working with data and I'm composing creatively from that.
That album is 45 minutes long, right? And I've read that it's the same duration as long as the bag of the chemotherapy drugs last.
Yeah, so the average time for my chemotherapy bags to empty into my body was 45 minutes. And I thought that seemed like the right amount of time for a piece of music. So it gives you enough time to immerse yourself into this kind of sound world, which is quite ambient, really, but it's still quite active in a sense. And one of my favorite parts of it is a melody which I created, played by the harp, but the melody itself comes completely from biodata from a Madagascan periwinkle, which is this really beautiful, very petite pink flower. And this plant has had an extraordinary impact on children's cancer care. So before the discovery of treatments coming from this plant, the death rate for childhood leukemia was about 90%. And then after the development of drugs using this plant, it completely flipped over. So now it's a 90% survival rate thanks to compounds in that plant. I've been so delighted to receive emails from people all over the world who listen to this while they're in hospital. It's been I don't even have the words for it. People share their stories and their experiences. And one of the motivating factors for this work is that if I can, I try to create things that make this very difficult experience just ever so slightly less difficult for the next person coming along to go through it, you know. It's always going to be a shit experience, you know, to be frank. It's always going to be hard to various degrees. But I think there are so many simple, human, caring things that we could do that could make it so much easier, that don't cost any money and don't, you know, cause any organizational, institutional, financial issues. That just things like making the sonic environment better for people. We know from research that has a huge impact on people's recovery and reduction of trauma and all of that kind of stuff. There's very compelling research. You know, I try to do a good balance of musical projects at any one time. Definitely for the last couple of years at least, the main focus has been on creating this work that either helps us have better conversations about cancer or improves the experience of cancer treatment for other people.
And then the last thing that I want to ask is a bit more broadly how we think about cancer as a society. And in your PhD work, you were criticizing some kind of notions that are present in public or, you know, media discourse that are harmful or inaccurate. And you talked about the pink ribbon commercialization. Could you expand a bit more on how we think about it?
Do you know what? I'd forgotten a little bit about the pink ribbon thing until I walked into a petrol station, a gas station, a couple of weeks ago in Cornwall in the south of England. And there were the people behind the checkout wearing these pink T-shirts. It's for a supermarket called Asda in the UK. And they have a charity called Tickled Pink, which is like a breast cancer fundraising thing. And I think it is truly one of the most awful names. I mean, tickled pink as a phrase you associate with giggly delight. And to be tickled pink at the idea of a potentially fatal breast cancer is so insensitive and so horrible. It really angers me, that kind of thing. And all of this pink stuff, I understand from a marketing perspective that people identify that colour with a cause and that might help fundraising activities. But actually, it's deeply infantilizing. Why do we have to have this horrible colour that's you know, the colour of 4-year-olds and 5-year-old girls' toys and stuff? It's awful. It strips people of dignity and makes it into a kind of trivial, childish issue. And it's a very serious issue. But it is an issue that I think, personally, should not really be treated any differently from heart disease or stroke or kidney disease. I find it very uneasy how society attributes all sorts of extra challenges to this completely natural disease. You know, we know that it's been found now that dinosaurs had cancer, giraffes have cancer, nematode worms have cancer. It's not a kind of a karmic human thing that anybody should feel guilt or shame about. It's a totally natural physiological process. All of these sort of meanings that are attached to this disease in a variety of cultures make it so difficult for that person who's going through the experience and going through treatment. It just heaps a whole load of extra suffering on top of what is already a really difficult time. So I can get quite angry about this and the judgments that people make. I receive so many ridiculous messages from people after my diagnosis, because I was very public about it and very open about it, which I think it's important, although I do respect other people's privacy, but I don't believe in hiding things. And I think by being open and having proper conversations and addressing these kind of issues, hopefully, again, that might make it slightly easier for someone coming down the line who's about to go through it. That brings me back to why sound is so potentially important, and being able to have these different conversations that don't fall into the trappings of infantilizing baby pink stuff, ribbons, being tickled pink, or sponsored runs and marathons where people get dressed up like a Muppet and with bright colours, and it's all about celebration, and it's just crazy. It's such a disconnect. It's so jarring that I'm hoping that more work involving sound, not just specifically about cancer, but about our bodies, allows us to have a much more honest, better and more adult conversation about our health and about our well-being.
Mm-hmm. It's good we're talking about this now, I think. I'm hoping that for some people who might be listening to this, it will be they will discover your music and your work, and as you said, that they will make their experience of treatment less horrible.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
But thank you so much for dedicating your time. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. That was our episode today. Thank you for listening. You heard the interview with Helen Anahita Wilson, composer, sound artist, and researcher based in Brighton. You can find out more about her creative work on her website, helenanahitawilson.com. Helen's musical work is available online and on streaming platforms. You can find her PhD thesis, alongside other book recommendations compiled by Helen herself, at the publication text at Nada's website. After the interview, Helen mentioned that she will be back in Vilnius next year for a new project. I want to thank Festival Ryšiai and its founder Karolis Vyšniauskas for inviting Helen to Vilnius and helping with the interview. The music you heard in this episode was made by Helen herself. The interview was recorded and edited by me, Nojus Setkauskas. The sound engineer is Kata Bitowt. The editor is Karolis Vyšniauskas. Pictures were taken by Francesco Ruffini. If there's any person in your life that you feel like would benefit from hearing this interview, please share it with them. We would greatly appreciate that. You can support Nada's work at nada.lt/support. Thank you once again, and I will see you next time.